Hello, morning, Jennifer.
Good morning.
Yeah, morning. My name is Robin.
My name is Barbara.
We are students from Faculty of Arts and Humanities. It's very nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, let's begin with the simple questions. Who is your favorite poet or who has had the important influence on your poetry?
I would say the first early important influence is Yeats.
Yeats.
Because of the intimacy of his language, the musicality. Early Yeats especially, from the turn of the century, I loved the way every poem felt like it was being whispered into your ear.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, I like Ezra Pound also too.
Yes.
Yes, and sometimes I also write some poems. But today's readers seldom read poems. They read fictions much more than poems. So, why do you think it is that way? And if that is true, are you afraid that poets are not as easily marketable as novelists?
I think poets aren't marketable. I think that there are a lot of reasons why people don't read poetry very much these days, although I think there's probably countercurrents to that. People aren't reading poetry because, one, I think there's a fear of poetry. In America especially, I think there's a sense that poetry is esoteric. People are afraid of the line breaks, and I think they don't understand the shape of a poem and how often line breaks are just simply pauses within the sentence or new shapes to the poem. I think poems are also, they mark a different rhythm, and from the rhythm of prose, which is the rhythm of everyday life, poems force you to slow down a little bit, to pay more attention to language in a way that you wouldn't in another kind of genre. Because you have to look at every word, you have to confront every word. The second part of your question about, am I worried? I think that, I think I am worried, but I also think that as a teacher of poetry and a writer, I feel a strong sense of responsibility for teaching poems well, for demonstrating how poems can engage with public life. I also think that people encounter poetry more often than you would think. One in music. I mean, music is a kind of poetry. I think hip hop, for instance, is a wonderful source of lyric poetry and lyric prosody. I also see that when people are in times of need, and you saw this a lot in 9/11, people turned to poems. And actually a poet who was frequently quoted right after 9/11 was Auden's, a lot of Auden's poetry. So now, given the recent surge of police violence against African Americans in America, more and more you see that the responses to that happens in the space of a poem. And people write poems in times of need. They turn to poems at funerals, at weddings, at ritual experiences. So I think that there's an intrinsic understanding that poetry is part of ritual, and poetry is part of ceremony. And I think that one thing that we can do as writers and readers and teachers of literature is to think too about how different literary forms, including poems, including even, I would even say novels aren't that well read. People don't read that much anymore. But to think about how these literary forms are part of our daily life and can teach us about being. And one more thing too, is like, I think there are surprising places where the lyric turns up. Tweets, for instance, and texts. I mean, these are places where you have to be very conscientious about succinctness, concision. Every word has to count for a lot or occupy multiple meanings, because you don't have a lot of space in a text or in a tweet. So it's possible to be more aware of how everyone is a maker of literary form.
Oh, that's very, I mean, a lot of art students are struggling with finance.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are worried about this.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my next question, I noticed there are some images of flowers in your poems, like tulips, like other flowers, which I can name right now. I mean, those words I didn't know before.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the image is reminiscent of some early Chinese poems in the Book of Songs. And I read your poems, I think you must be a poet who loves nature. Because for me, if one who really deeply loves literature must be one who loves nature. And maybe my conclusion seems to be a little bit arbitrary or hasty. What do you think about that? Do you love nature, or do you get inspired by nature or from nature?
I love nature. I do. I do think of myself as a nature poet. I think there's two ways to think about it. There's the biographical, which is that when I grew up, I lived in a very wooded area, and I played in the woods, and I spent a lot of time outside, and I've always been someone who would go hiking or wandering whenever I had the opportunity. The other side is that I'm very interested in how nature isn't simple. And in my first book, The History of Anonymity, I write about nature because I'm, in a sense, writing about fairy tales. And the space of the forest and the space of nature was also a space of darkness and the unknown and mystery. And nature is not a beautiful retreat. Nature is actually quite dangerous and unpredictable. And in that sense, it models human experience. But in the other sense, it's also out of human control. And when we try to control it, as it's evident now in an age of climate change, it comes back and hurts us.
That's right.
So I think that I'm interested too in, I guess, upending our notions of nature as this beautiful retreat. And I'm very suspicious of romantic poets who use nature for pathetic fallacy or who use nature to project emotional life onto them. I mean, nature is not our tool for creative expression. And I am interested in how nature can become a space of fear and unknowingness, uncertainty. So I think too, I think of my poems as being philosophical, and I'm working through questions about ontological questions and questions about what are we doing, who are we, why are we here, and nature's one kind of topos in that.
So, Jennifer, I've read some of your essay, which I think echoes something in your poems, also about the nature and the relationship between you and nature. So I read one of your essay that evening will come on forgetting and other natural erasures. I think this is a very enlightening essay for me. And I find you end this essay with a sentence that I remember that an intimacy formed between me and the trees. It was not my imagination that we shared a stillness, a tacit biology, however modest, and lost in pause of time. I let myself vanish into my own awe. And also, there are some sentences in this essay that how even as you behold the desert, you are made smaller by what you see. And nature does not demand the burden of my imagination. So some sentences like this, I think is very enlightening for me, and I find the in connection between you and the nature is very subtle, in a way that you respect the nature and as well as you respect the nature, but with a very humble state position. So do you think that in your the way you possess nature, the way you interpret the nature, when you write the poems, it's a kind of intervention towards nature?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, I do think so. I think you've made a lot of good observations about the sense of a responsibility, but also the respect. I think that to assume we have any power over nature is a mistake, because we don't. I also think that one of the writers who I've been really influenced by in writing that essay, but also in writing my second book of poems, is Dorothy Wordsworth, who has a collection, well, it's not a collection, her journals were published, and she herself was not, she did not call herself a writer. She was Wordsworth's sister. In many ways, she was his amanuensis. And what's interesting about the journal entries is not only they're sort of very ordinary descriptions of life, but oftentimes she describes a landscape or field, and there's no subjectivity to it. There's no I, and it's as if that she's describing something, and the description absents herself. The natural description absents her from the landscape, and I think that's a really powerful moment in her work. Similarly, she has diary entries where she writes, "I cannot remember today." So I think what, as a writer, looking at those entries made me very suspicious of a poet like her brother, William Wordsworth, who is always using poetry as an occasion to reflect more deeply on the self. Nature is that which launches selfhood. And in Dorothy Wordsworth's journals, nature reminds us of the insignificance of self, of powerlessness, and of also awe. If you think about the experience of awe, or even of the sublime, the self is subsumed by what is around the self. And I think that's important. I mean, I believe in proceeding without an ego. So, I mean, maybe that's the kind of intervention I'm looking at too, where being powerlessness, having an experience of powerlessness, is also making your observations more acute. And it's a kind of ecology too, where you are just one organism of a larger ecosystem. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Your question is so smart.
It's a very good answer. Yeah, and you mentioned the powerlessness. I've also read another essay of you, which named on writing a horse named Never. It's very interesting essay too, and it made me think of the memory, which is also an important theme in the poetry, especially in the romanticism poetry. And you said that nothing can be erased. Perhaps there are no new words, only the residue of the older ones. And erasure is an unrequited art. It expresses our desire to forget, and at the same time, the impossibility of forgetting. Also, the never is, I'm mentioning never in the other essay, that never is both our power and our absolute powerlessness. So, considering your sentences like this, I wonder what's your attitude towards the memory, and how about your personal interaction with the past, with your past?
These are great questions. This is
for me, it's a tough one.
It's very tough, and I've never thought of those two essays as in conversation. I wrote them about 5 or 6 years apart, but thank you for observing that. My relationship to memory, I mean, memory is a narrative, and it's another kind of form. I'm very suspicious of memory.
So you don't believe in memory?
I do believe in memory. We have lots of memories, but they shift according to context and according to what you need in the moment. Robin, you'd mentioned Ezra Pound, and he's someone who uses memory in a way that is very instrumental to, depending on the description or a sort of poetic innovation, memory becomes a means of interruption, fracture, and also I'm thinking most recently of the P's and cantos, where memories are interrupting, but also they mess up the rhythm of the poem, and there's no cohesion, in part because the memories keep messing up the poem. But on the other hand, they're also consoling him when he's imprisoned in Pisa. So if you think about, well, if I think about how memories function in my life, depending on if I'm sad or happy or I'm having a hard time, memories soothe me, but they also allow me to escape from my contemporary moment.
Okay.
And I think, so what I'm describing is a kind of duality. You mentioned the quotation, the never is both our power and our absolute powerlessness. I think memory is a moment where we can try to control a story and then about ourselves. But the powerlessness is that you're still you're still powerlessness to the need to make, the desire to create something. Memory is not necessarily true. Memory is also not necessarily, it's rarely accurate.
Also, memory can be very self-deceitful.
It's very, and I think that as I get older too, I see how memory is just often the only thing you have left of a lot of relationships or of former selves, or it's painful to remember your former self. When you have access to that, you're revisiting something that you don't like about yourself, or that you don't want to remember. And there's different levels of feeling. Like if I think about an old breakup, it doesn't hurt anymore, but I wish I wouldn't remember it.
Yeah.
So there's it's like what happens in the cantos. Like he doesn't have a lot of control. It seems like the way the memories intrude in that poem. It seems like he's totally powerlessness to the ways that memories keep coming to him, and kind of are obstacles to writing a cohesive poem.
For me, memory is very consoling, and it is also a resource of literature. And you just mentioned Dorothy Wordsworth and William Wordsworth, and you actually have written a poem about Dorothy Wordsworth. There's some lines which is very interesting. Yeah, you said?
It's a dirty poem.
Yeah, you said, the daffodils can go fuck themselves. By this line, do you mean, in some sense, Dorothy Wordsworth has been overshadowed by her brother, William Wordsworth?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, a lot of his journals and his poems remain unpublished. Yeah, do you mean that? And you think there are some lines which you are speaking for Dorothy Wordsworth?
Yeah.
And the last line, this is a poem about war. You mean you are indicating that in some sense there's a war between Dorothy Wordsworth and William Wordsworth, even they were actually in good relationship with each other.
Yeah, the war is more about the war between women writers and literary history. And William used to go through her journals and mine them for ideas for poems. And I was very aware. I had to teach Tintern Abbey, and as I was teaching that to my students, it's so long. It's such a long poem, and it's very beautiful. And it certainly illustrates the spontaneous combustion of emotion that he talks about. But I had a student raise her hand and say, "Who's he talking to? Who's the you? Like, who's standing there next to him as he's letting out all this spontaneous combustion of emotion?" It was like hundreds of lines, and I said, "Oh, that's Dorothy." And I was very, it was very distressed to think about what is it like to be a you who has no space to speak and that has to listen so much. And to me, that seemed like a kind of allegory of what it's like to be a woman writer in the face of literary historical tradition. And Wordsworth reigns supreme in that tradition. I think I was angry too, because I wrote that poem during a time when there was a lot of conversation about the lack of coverage, the lack of book reviewing of women writers in major publications like the New York Times or the New Yorker. They started counting the statistics of how often women writers were reviewed. And in particular, there were two authors who were fighting this out in the media. And I'm a poet. No one reviews poetry, and the audience for poetry is small. But it seemed that hundreds of years after the Wordsworths, that this problem of women's voices being silenced by the dominance of the male literary voice, it seemed to continue to be such a huge problem. And I think even now. So I was writing it out of anger. I was writing it thinking about both the literary past and the literary present of my writing. I also, I just read Jamaica Kincaid's book. I can't remember what it's called now. Lucy.
Oh, Lucy.
Lucy by Jamaica Kincaid. And it's about a Jamaican maid, and she's working in America, and her boss, an American woman, a white woman, says, "Look at all these beautiful daffodils." And the maid named Lucy is furious and starts tearing all the daffodils up. And it's because she's remembering her experience growing up in Jamaica and being an English colony and having to learn all these books. And one of the things that's remarkable about a lot of British colonies like Jamaica, when you read these poems by Wordsworth, daffodils can't grow in Jamaica. So, and yet they're told that this is an important trope. Flowers are an important trope in poetry, and this is an important poem. And so she was expressing her rage. So I also thought it would be fun to curse off daffodils and to tell daffodils to go fuck themselves. Sometimes I just want to play in a poem. And like, you can't be angry. I can't get angry in my professional life. I can't go around yelling at people.
The line's very powerful, I mean.
Yeah.
The line's very powerful for me.
I'm glad. And you're not the ideal reader in some ways. Barbara is.
I'm a feminist.
Okay, good. We should all be feminists.
Yeah. Okay, for me, you have written all your poems in free verse. Have you tried to written poems with meter and rhyme? And what do you think of the biggest difference between these two types of poems? Like William Wordsworth, let's talk about him again. Yeah, he writes about nature. He writes about nature, and he writes his poem with rhyme, but not with meter. So what do you think is this biggest difference between your poems and his poems?
Well, I had a very formal training. In college, I had a teacher who put me through my paces, and we had to write a pentameter, so we did blank verse, we did English and Italian sonnets, we did sapphics. I studied Latin in high school and college, so we also had to do dactylic hexameter. We had to memorize parts of the Aeneid. So I had a lot of, I would say, training in it. I don't know if I was ever that great at it, but I always think about form, even though my poems aren't metrical. So I think that one thing too is, I'm writing at a different time, and I think we're in a time where free verse is what poetry sounds like now. And I think there's a lot of, I don't find my natural voice in formal poetry. And I think to do it well now, that's not my interest, to figure out a way to write informal forms in a way that sounds natural to the vernacular. And that said, I think that the formal training is really important to have control over your line. And I think about the musculature of the line, the texture of the line. I like a very clean, fluid line. And one poet who I think about in regards to this is Robert Frost, who writes very formal poetry. He writes in blank verse a lot, but he's somehow subsumed it into a vernacular, so it sounds like regular speech, just slightly different. But I like the cleanness of his language, and like what he does in a poem like Acquainted with the Night is he uses a lot of monosyllabic words in that poem. I believe it's an iambic pentameter. I don't know if it's a sonnet or not, but I can't remember if it's 14 or 12 lines. But he'll play with the word acquainted, and that becomes the longest word in a line. I've been one acquainted with the night. And that's a line in the poem, where every word is very simple in one syllables, and then you get to acquainted. It slows it down. It fits into the meter, but but really what you pay attention to is speed, and you pay attention to when you stay or dwell on one word. So I think about that, and I think that comes from formal training. So I think about the rhythm of the line, and I don't think I would think about that as carefully if I weren't thinking about form. And I've tried. Some poems are failed attempts at So I have like a long poem, and it's coming out in Boston Review later this year, and it's in sapphics, or it started out in sapphics, which is a very unnatural form for English, but it didn't work. It's in quatrains. It has, I can't remember the whole form, but I have it written down in my notebook. But it just, you have to revise it to what the poem has to be rather than the form you've adopted. So, I try to play with it, but I also ignore it at the end.
And my next question is: as a scholar, you analyze others' works, and as a poet, sometimes other people analyze your works. So, what does it feel like if someone analyzes your work or interpret your works in a way which you don't approve of? But sometimes you are analyzing others' works in a way they don't approve of.
Well, I don't review poetry that much, but I prefer to write about dead poets.
Dead poets. Oh, that's good. They don't speak. They don't complain. They don't speak.
And my preferred area is modernism. But when I review books of poetry, my intention is to figure out what the poet is doing and what conversation, particularly in terms of like what's the literary past that this poet is engaged with, and how can I learn from that engagement. I don't think I reviewed enough books to have people respond to it, but I have had reviews where I thought, this is just wrong, and what it feels like is, it's a very strange feeling to be talked about, and you kind of wish you didn't have to see it. But I'll give you two examples. I had one person review my first book, and it was a very positive review, but he entirely misunderstood the book.
Your books.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, he read it in a way that was, I was kind of shocked. He said that the book was about suicide, and the book, and that there was one speaker throughout the whole book, and then you get to the end, and the speaker commits suicide. So he read the book as a book-length narrative, and the narrative was just, I don't even know how he arrived at that. And another review I got was from, and also, I don't know if this matters, but it mattered to me. The reviewer was Asian American. He was an Asian American critic. The other reviewer was an Asian American poet, and it was an omnibus review, so he reviewed 4 other books. And he had this one line, I'll never forget it, because it was so insulting. He said, everything that is wrong with tone in American poetry is in this book. And I didn't even understand what he meant. And he defined tone through a description, through an analogy. So it was unclear what he meant. But neither review was, one's positive, one's negative, but neither review was terribly helpful. And I think I've had reviews that were not super positive, some maybe lukewarm, but if you can learn from the review about yourself or about how people read, that's a good review, regardless of the ultimate.
So you read those reviews? I
do. Okay. It's hard not to. There aren't that many.
And those critics do that, yes, or they will lose their jobs.
And I mean,
we can't let poets interpret their own works and take the job from those critics.
No. And it's important to review poetry, because as you guys were mentioning earlier, there's not a lot of readers for poetry, and every review might garner more readers. But I mean, more important to learn from the review than to learn from review is that there should be a conversation. So I think that my experience writing about other poets and reviewing contemporary poetry makes me very aware that there's an ongoing conversation about poetry, about the past and about the present and the future of poetry, and it's dynamic and it's changing and it can be really exciting. So, you know, even those negative reviews, like I think that that's just the poet who hated my book. You know, I don't care if he hates it. I think it was a stupid review, but I only wish that like the conversation he was engaging in were more interesting. But the review ultimately reflected some kind of value about literature that is important. You know, what is tone? Like what is important to American poetry? Why isn't tone? Why doesn't he think tone is present?
Okay.
So, yeah.
So Jennifer, so what do you think of a prophecy in your works? I also read these words sentences in your essay that literature isn't a prophecy, but it presents us with one of the healthier consolation practices in an age too meager with solace and recompense. So I think, do you have any expectation of yourself to present some future in your own work, just when you're writing?
Barbara, your questions are so great.
She asked the top questions.
No, but this is what I'm talking about. Like I'm learning from your questions. So thank you. Well, one of my favorite definitions of poetry is by Theodor Adorno, and he says that contained in lyric poems is the dream of a world which might be better. That might be better. And I think that if there's any kind of expectation I have for my poem, or if I want my poems to do something, I hope it's to encourage deeper engagement with other people. I think poems enable an intimacy that is really unique. And think about a poem that you love, and think about the feeling it activates in you. That's beyond literary analysis. Like the feeling that a poem, like this is how I felt when I first read Yeats. I felt so many things, and that felt deeply intimate. And I went to grad school, I did all the writing, and I worked on my papers, and I can still get quiet from a poem and not know, why is this poem making me feel all these things? I hope my poems do that, some of them. And I also, in writing my second book, I was thinking about all the questions that you're talking about, actually, about what do poems do, what does nature do, what does poetry and nature have, what's the relationship about? But I was also thinking about, a lyric poem is so often occasion and solitude. It's such a private experience, and now that I'm older, now that I live in a city as opposed to the countryside, and I'm a mother, it's really important for me to think about, how can poems push beyond that privacy? How do you engage with otherness, with complications, with strangeness? Because there's something not entirely fulfilling about privacy and solitude. And you realize that there needs to be a public component to it. There needs to be some kind of exchange, and at least in my desire for a poem, I want the poem to reach beyond the solitary moment that occasioned it.
So you do want yourself to be a prophecy to some extent in your poem, right?
I don't know. Being a prophet sounds really frightening. But yeah, I mean, I hope that some kind of understanding comes out of it that's larger than just a poem's content. That people can reach out to each other through a poem.
Yeah, I think Aristotle says something like that. Poetry is about prophecy, which predicts what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Historian is about stories in the past.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, if you write poems, you know, you don't want to just write poems about being sad and lonely.
Yes.
Because it can't just be about yourself. And I think that's what I brought up being a mother. I was thinking a lot about, I want my son to be part of the world, and I want him to feel its complexity in a way that, that makes him understand that he's not the only person in the world. And I think there's a comparable experience that I want in my poems.
Right. And I'm also interested in your habit of poem writing. Like if I want to write a poem, I would sit down with a pen and think something about love and take something from my mind and write down some lines. But some people, they will take a walk by the lake and suddenly when the muse of poetry possesses him and or inspires him, and he goes, they go home.
They run home.
Yeah, they run home and take the lines down. Which one is more like you?
Oh God, it's probably more the second.
The second one.
Yeah, I don't have good habits of poetry or writing poetry. I don't have time to write every day. I try to, and I don't feel like I'm not inspired every day.
Okay. Yeah.
But I do want to. I immerse myself in reading, and I do take a lot of walks, and I try to pay attention, and I think in that, even if I'm not physically writing, paying attention and living my life as I must is a way of preparing for poems.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. Everyone has different habit of writing.
Yeah. Some people
Sometimes
need a couple.
I do take a walk by the lake and something occurs, something dawns on my mind, and I go home and write down something.
Yeah,
that's right.
Oftentimes when I have stuff on my mind, I can't write because it's too much stuff. What do you do, Barbara, when you write poems?
I don't write poems. I like writing a story.
Short stories maybe.
Yeah.
That takes more diligence.
It's more difficult.
And I have one last question.
Okay.
What does it mean to be Asian American in American society right now? I mean, in the past, some Asian American writers struggled with their identities, like Maxine Hong Kingston. Woman Warrior is the storytelling about her growing up in Chinatown. And I mean, it was very racist in her generation, but now I think racism is still there, but it's not that violent now.
No.
And I think I noticed some Asian American writers concentrates on some issues of Asian American, like gay writing and some universal topics of literature. And like Yang Jin Lee, he writes about white men. She doesn't write about Asian American right now. I mean, sometimes she still does that, but she also writes other topics, writes about other topics. And my question is, for you, as an Asian American women writer, do you hit some glass ceiling when you publish your poems or other works?
Yeah, I think that's a really complicated question. I mean, you're right to an extent that the racism against Asian Americans in particular is less violent, but I think it's omnipresent. I think that there's, especially now, I think there's an expectation for minority writers, ethnic American writers, to be writing specifically about their heritage or about their identity. And I think there's also an expectation that you write overtly about politics and issues, as if that our voice. So there's a certain, I recognize a certain there's certain constraint to what's expected of Asian American writers. So it's much harder, I find, to write. I mean, I think my poems are obliquely about politics. My poems aren't issue driven or news driven, but I think about this. As I said, I think of myself as a philosophical poet, where I think around these issues. So I've had experiences where I think editors struggle to classify my work because it's not overtly Asian American. It doesn't
yes.
wave the flag of identity.
It's very universal, yeah, actually.
Yeah, I hope so. And it's very frustrating. It's very frustrating, and that it's not issue driven or overtly political. So, there are more Asian American writers in the public, and it's more common to see Asian American writers. But there's also the issue of tokenism, where there's room for a couple, but if you're not writing in these expected ways, you're excluded. So I do get some of that. I don't want to change my writing to be more popular, and I also don't want to sound ungrateful for the opportunities I've had, because it's not like I struggle as much as anyone else, but I'm not struggling to get published. I'm just struggling to be, I'm struggling in the sense that I wish Asian American poetry were read with more openness. And, it would be great to be read without people thinking about your author photo, for instance. Also as a woman poet, like I think there are expectations too. Just the question of, my publisher was helping me pick out author photos, and they just want me to smile and look pretty. And that doesn't come naturally to me when I'm being photographed. So like that there's like weird expectations that I think white male authors don't experience. But I wish poems that were less overtly about politics and poems that are political were seen as in greater dialogue than they are, because I think they are in dialogue, but I think critics miss it, or editors miss it. So, it still feels like white writers can write about anything.
Yeah.
And like that, white male writers in particular can write about anything.
So you still feel sometimes you need to cater to their readership, especially white readership?
I think if I were to cater to them, I'd be writing a very different poem. And I just don't know how to write that poem.
Okay.
And I think too that I don't want to give them what they want. I'd rather challenge them. And if they're not gonna publish my poems because they're not quote unquote Chinese, or they don't represent as they want me to represent my cultural heritage, if that's what they want, I feel like I do. In a way that suits me. I have to write the poems that I have to. I don't want to write the poems that would, when they put their Norton anthology together and they put their one Asian American poet, they're probably not going to choose me.
Okay.
And that's their problem. There should be more Asian American poets in the Norton anthology, and they should be writing about more diverse topics. So there's a lack of diversity in what styles and content Asian American writers can write about. Yeah, that's been my experience, and I think it has changed. The first time I sent poems in my early 20s, I got an editor write back and say, "You should write closer to
Asian Americans' experience."
Yes, and this was by an Asian American editor, and I didn't change. I was like, I don't want to be in this magazine.
Yeah, that's good. That's very feminist.
Stupid magazine.
So, considering your poems about nature and your attitude as Asian American, so I find, is there any connection that in your between them? We could find that in your research on the pastoral imagination, do you really consider your identity and the poems about nature is in a way of a pastoral writing? And
I think so. I mean, I also think I have a very flexible understanding of pastoral. I think about pastoral, there's many ways of thinking of pastoral, and I think pastoral is not strictly a nature poem. It's actually a poem about, historically it's been a poem about shepherds, the lives of shepherds. So just by that historical fact, it's a poem about people in a place. and about the distances that their geographical location and their socioeconomic location places them. They're at a distance from the city, they're at a distance from cultural centers, a distance from quote-unquote civilization. So I think that distance, the distance that pastoral inevitably has to mediate is something that I'm writing about when I write about nature or identity. And it's like, I feel like I'm very oblique sometimes, but I do think that I'm thinking pastoral, it's pastorally in my poems. I'm thinking about the proximities and distances from different people in different places.
Okay, it's great talking to you.
Yeah, it's great talking to you too. Thank you so
for this
much for your
opportunity.
very smart question. Thank you so much.
Thank you.